India has been a cauldron for a very fantastic experiment which happened almost 5 decades ago. Very few people know that cable television was pioneered in India through an experiment which was done between the American Space Agency, NASA, and the Indian Space Agency, ISRO. The experiment is called SITE. And to give us details of this wonderful SITE experiment, I have with me Dr. Kiran Karnik, a very well-known face and person who has worked with the Indian Space Research Organization, was deeply involved with this SITE experiment, and then he carried forward his experiences and joined the Discovery Network in India as its head. So, end to end, if he pioneered cable television in India, then here is somebody who also deployed it fully. Thanks a lot for joining me, Dr. Kiran. Always a pleasure talking to you. One of those few people who can call a spade, and I remember you calling ISRO squeaky clean when they were under fire. Tell us a little bit about the SITE experiment. One, what is its expansion, and what did it do, and how did it help?
First, Pallava, thank you for having me here. Delighted to share something of what I yet think is a seminal event and a great one 50 years ago, when Satellite Instructional Television Experiment, that's the full form, SITE, was launched, kicked off on August 1st, 1975. Memories of SITE now are old, but they stick to your mind. And the one thing I must mention to you, Pallava, to start with, is that for people like me, I was all of 22 when I started working. I started in atomic energy, and one fine day, my boss at that time, delighted, privileged to work with him, the legendary Vikram Sarabhai, told me, Kiran, I want you to go to Ahmedabad and work on the space program on a very interesting project. So, 22 years old, I went off there, and then the experience of my lifetime. In some ways, I might summarize it as saying, common to me and many, many other folks in ISRO, I would say, head in the stars and cow dung on your feet. So at one end, you're dreaming big things and out in space. On the other, you're rooted to the reality of India. And that was what SITE was. It used and borrowed American satellite, the NASA satellite, as you mentioned, the ATS-6. ATS was Advanced Technology Satellite, and the sixth in the series, which is the first ever experiment, first ever technology to do direct broadcasting. It had a 30-foot diameter dish, something like what Nisar is going to have soon. And very interesting concept. I love the innovation there. How do you launch such a big satellite? You don't have a 30-foot rocket that can carry something 30 foot. So you do what you do when it rains. What do you do when you're out of the rain? You fold the umbrella. When you go into the rain, you just open it. This operated on pretty much the same principle, that you go into space and then you deploy that. And it was the first direct broadcasting satellite which you could receive straight away. In many ways, this was the precursor of what today you call DTH. I understand what you're saying.
Which is direct to home.
Absolutely. When you say cable to home, I understand what you're saying, Pallava, but in a correct technical sense, the direct broadcasting, which we called it then, has now become direct to home, which is DTH. And the unique thing was, this was the first time for such an experiment anywhere in the world on this scale to take television programs out to really remote areas. We operated in Orissa in villages where we ran the TV sets off batteries because there was no power. We operated in Bihar, north of the Ganga, where every year you had floods, and I would hesitate to say it on broadcast television, but maybe I can share it now. Some of our maintenance teams had to go at the time of the monsoon into that part via Nepal. Just go into Nepal and come back in. But the amazing thing, and this is something worth remembering, the very young engineers there, all like me in their early 20s, maybe late 20s at the most, maintained these TV sets and worked with such high motivation that our uptime, or you might say the downtime at the other end, was less than that of urban TV sets then in Delhi. And television reached Orissa, North Bengal, and four others, not Bihar, I'm sorry, and four other states, 6 states in all, before it got to other urban areas in India. So that was SITE broadcasting, agricultural, and development programs, programs for school children, enrichment programs, science programs especially, and then what we then called a national program, 30 minutes of a common program that went across the country. So the programming was area specific, language specific, but one part was common that everybody shared. That was very broad. I can go on and on about site, but let me stop there by way of introducing what site is.
Tell me a little bit about the technicalities. What was the satellite like? How did the downlink happen? How did the uplink happen? And what was NASA's role in this, and what was ISRO's role in this?
Well, NASA provided the satellite, and this was a satellite which, very frankly, they were on a technology binge. So this was a great idea which someone came up with, that can have a very large satellite which will enable reception in an easy way. Do recall, Pallava, and you would know this from your knowledge of science and history of that. You may have been too young then, but at that time, satellites were used for telecommunication, and for telecommunication, which is low bandwidth because you carry mainly voice. That was all that was carried at that time. And to receive that, you needed massive antennas in the ground. It's like trying to collect rain in an inverted umbrella. I mentioned umbrella earlier. And the bigger the umbrella, the more rain you collect. So you wanted to pick up the signal, which was very weak because it went up from the ground to the satellite, which was then, in geostationary orbit, more than 30,000 kilometers above the Earth, and came back to Earth. And by the time it came back to Earth, the signal was weaker. And because you couldn't have large satellites, the signal was even weaker. So you had to pick it up using a very large dish. We had one such in India for international telecommunications, which was 97 feet in diameter. And again, some smart technologists, most technologists are smart, admittedly, said, hey, why not invert this? Why don't we put a large dish up in space, and then on the ground, we can do what you have on the satellite, it's a small dish. And they worked on this technology, hats off to the US technologists and NASA. They actually made a satellite with a 30-foot diameter antenna, with the concept I mentioned, since you couldn't take a 30-foot diameter antenna out into space, the unfurlable antenna, as it's called. And that enabled the reception of the signal and sending it back in a more concentrated form, because you have a large dish like a mirror, a concave mirror, and it beams back to Earth. So the signal is a little more concentrated. It's yet diffuse. But now with this, you could receive it with a 10-foot dish. And that is what we installed in 2,400 villages across the 6 states and received in the villages with this chicken mesh antenna, as we called it then, which was just a mesh. It was not a solid dish. And therefore, the requirements for precision engineering were there, but not as sharply required as you need for earlier dishes. So that was the kind of technology. The signals went up, or the TV programs went up from our main Earth station in Ahmedabad, and one more in Delhi, which is standby, but also used for other programs to go up, and was received in these 2,400 villages spread across the country on a 10-foot dish, and electronics, which today you might see as, in simplistic terms, equal to your set-top box, which you have at home. And today, of course, your DTH dishes are, like a dinner plate, but way too bigger than a dinner plate.
That is
and
true.
Here we have this 10-foot thing put there. And the part of it, which is very important, and we might discuss that a little later, is the concept that this was not like DTH for private individual viewing. This was for community viewing. So the TV sets which were installed in the villages were community viewing sets in a common community location, like a school or a panchayat ghar, where irrespective of caste or class, everybody could assemble. Otherwise, you would have had problems. So this was it in the programs where I said agriculture, education, development in general.
So did India have its own rockets and satellites when we did this?
No, Pallava. And this is another great part of the philosophy of the space program, in many ways deriving from the atomic energy program, that the applications drove the technology. So the application was satellite broadcasting to reach remote areas. Since we did not have the capability to launch satellites, large satellites, and did not have the capability at that time to make such satellites, these were borrowed. The launch was by the US, the satellite was a NASA satellite, but the ground equipment, this is important, was all not only made in India, but designed and developed in India. So the ground equipment was done. And then step by step, as part of the vision which Dr. Sarabhai laid out, we first began to make satellites and then the launch vehicles to carry these satellites.
So how many years after sight did we get our first rocket, and how many years later did we get our first satellite, Aryabhatta?
Well, just tracing back, and apart from these two, the interesting part, I mentioned the sort of step-by-step approach, very systematically, applications driven. So after all the ground equipment had been done for site, the next step was the satellite. So the satellite was conceived and designed here, but made outside. This was INSAT, which combined telecom, broadcasting, and meteorology. And then the next step was making the satellite here, and then the rocket that could launch it. So, the rocket launches came much later, and we started in a big way in the 80s and slowly scaled up to having the large rockets that could take up. But INSAT was a very large satellite being multi-service. So it took a while for us to get to the capability to launch INSAT. Till then, we depended on foreign launches. But step by step, as I said, the technology was integrated here. But again, as I say, step by step, I emphasize that it was driven by what the application is. The application was not satellite broadcasting. The application was taking education and development to the most backward disadvantaged places in India. Therefore, you needed satellite broadcasting. Therefore, you needed a satellite. Therefore, you needed a launch vehicle.
And this was the first direct-to-home broadcast anywhere in the world?
Well, I wouldn't quite say that, because the US, not knowing what to do with the technology they had developed, did use the satellite for about a year, and they demonstrated how it could be received. But it was a pure technology demonstration, you might say a proof of concept. The application and the scale of even having a few hundred, even the 2,400 that we had, receivers on the ground, was only in India. So the first large-scale one, and which is why I guess Arthur Clarke, the famous science fiction writer and futurist, called it the greatest communication experiment in history. Maybe a bit of hyperbole, but I think there's truth behind that.
It remains. If it spurred the world to get direct to home television, and if that was spurred from rural districts in India, we need to celebrate it. It is so. What was the reaction of the local people? Because you were deeply involved in traveling to all these remote places with your head in stars and your feet in cow
Not on the
dung.
feet. Well, it's tremendous, and this was, I guess, for many of us, the motivation that added to what we had is just trying to do something. To see, both adults and particularly children watch the television, and the magical part, keep in mind these are really remote villages, and this was 1975. Most of them, if not all, had not even seen a moving picture. They had not been to a cinema theater. And suddenly here was this box that on August 1st, 1975, began to deliver pictures out of this little box out there. So imagine a villager in some remote part who never seen this. This is magic for him or her. And the children were so taken with it. The novelty effect, the kind of awe, and to see their reactions and their eyes light up to what they were seeing as they began to understand this was phenomenal. It was more satisfying than anything you can have. And I guess that is what has driven the ISRO and the ISRO culture of wanting to do something that gives you fulfillment and satisfaction.
See, one name which sticks with sight is Professor Yashpal's name. He played a critical role. And he was one of the finest science communicators we've ever had, a former ISRO scientist. Tell me a little bit about Professor Yashpal's role.
Well, he was the director of the Space Applications Center within the ambit of this, which is where it all happened. I should mention another central figure, which is Professor Chittnesses, who was Sarabhai's right-hand man when ISRO was first set up and created and conceived it. He was the program manager for SITE, which is like the CEO for SITE directly. And Professor Yashpal, as director SAC, oversaw everything. But as you rightly said, Professor Yashpal was one of those Renaissance scientists which came out of the old tradition, which, I guess in many ways, Dr. Baba kindled with an interest in art, culture, literature, and outstanding work in science. So Professor Yashpal came from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the TIFR in Bombay, in, I guess, 1972. And some of us, like Professor Chittnesses and I, we were there a few years earlier. Professor Chittnesses, many years earlier, moving from the physical research laboratory to the space program. Professor Yashpal came, and he brought in tremendous energy, dynamism, and a network of key contacts across not just science, but more importantly, for us, particularly for those of us involved in what you might call the software of it, the program making, the conception. he brought in people, the greatest dramatists, artists, writers, whom he knew directly or indirectly, and began to make this unique mix which we had in Ahmedabad at the Space Application Center of having social scientists, program makers, creative people, management people, and technologists and scientists. So
Tell
very
me,
unique. Nowhere in the world you have this kind of thing.
tell me a little bit about Professor Chittness, because we are going to celebrate his 100th anniversary, and I'm told he still remains very fit and remembers everything what happened. Tell me a little bit about his role and contribution.
But just amazing, just amazing. And it's sad that in some ways, but I think that was the ISRO style, that these were low profile people under the radar. Very few people outside ISRO would even know the name. And yet he was so central not only to ISRO itself and its formation, selection of Shar and Tumbar rocket launching range, etc., but in site itself, since we're talking of site, he played a very, very major role as a program manager. We had a very young team, as I said, all of us, most of us in our 20s, a few maybe in the 30s, very few. And Professor Chittness was in some ways the mentor, the guide, even the father figure, if you like, who oversaw these highly motivated, driven, impatient young people who wanted to, take over the world tomorrow kind of people. And he brought sanity, clarity, and a very systematic, organized approach to what we were doing. And in later years, even after he was director Space Application Center later, and got very interested, you mentioned science communication, in all the communication work we had done and carried forward. He spent many years in Pune after retirement, guiding students, teaching at the center there, which dealt with communication, the media center there, which had been set up as part of UGC's countrywide classroom program, which fortunately, you forgot to mention that fortunately I was involved with that immediately after ISRO, the countrywide classroom program, and we had set up an inter-university center, one more of Professor Yashpals' innovative institutional frameworks for inter-university centers. And Professor Chittness was deeply involved with that. He taught at Pune University, helped them a great deal, mentored generations of students, and even today, as he's 100, he continues to be active mentally. Physically, he's okay, but has some issues. But mentally, he's yet active. He remembers dates, people, what happened where. It's just truly, I can't believe it. At 100, to have that kind of both memory and mental alertness to be able to do it. Hats off to him.
Now let's jump ahead a little bit. You did cite. It was followed up with some other experiments. You had the Kada experiment. Tell me very quickly about these two experiments which happened after that. And then let's jump ahead straight to your discovery experience.
Well, Kada, very briefly, it was along with site that we started Kada. And I must mention in 2 sentences that, some of us had concerns that satellite broadcasting and the direct to remote village is a fantastic way of taking education, development news, just news to remote areas. It also has potentially a very strong centralizing possibility, which we felt was, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. So Kada was an experiment in complete decentralization. We set up a TV transmitter in a village called Peach in Kada district of Gujarat, which is probably more famous for being the home of Amul, the milk dairy. And we worked with Dr. Kurian and his team of, cooperatives. This was an experiment in setting up a small district level rural television station which covered a limited area. Ahmedabad was on, I would say in retrospect, unfortunately on the outskirts. And I used to get so much heckling, today you would call it trolling, from friends in Ahmedabad saying, what are these rural, cow and rural hut programs that you're showing? We want something more and something different. Because that was meant for the villages of Kada. It was a completely decentralized operation, an experiment in participative communication, where the villagers, and by the time we were a year, 2 years old, the villagers were practically making the programs. They would tell us what kind of thing, what story, and enact it themselves. So it worked wonderfully, wide recognition, won the first UNESCO IPDC prize, etc. And, it was something unique. It was a model, just as SITE was for INSAT and later expansion of DTH. Kada was a model for what followed in the Asian Games time, or what was then called LPTs, the low-powered TV transmitters, which spread across the country. And at one time, Doordarshan was doing one a day, as Mr. Gill, who was then Secretary INB, used to say. And Keda worked wonderfully and decentralized rural communication. But in these things, market forces ultimately play their role, and television got much more urbanized, focused on urban areas, focused on entertainment. And the countrywide classroom and some educational programs were one way of trying to protect that space of saying, let's use it for education.
How did that translate into you becoming the head of Discovery India?
Well, I don't like to talk of personal thing, but I transitioned from ISRO to the countrywide classroom, which was then called the umbrella organization, was the Inter-University Center for Educational Communication, which is now called the Consortium for Educational Communication. Again, interesting because decentralized, we had studios across the country in many states and in the universities, and they made the educational programs. The Inter-University Center coordinated, did the overall layout, did much of the work there. So I worked there for 3 years on educational programs. But this was post 1991 when I left ISRO. And post 1991, as you would recall, the thrust of the economy was towards liberalization, privatization, LPG formula, I might say. And one of the non-merit goods, as was seen, was higher education, saying higher education should not be subsidized. The government should not be putting out money there. So they didn't cut it off, but grants, which this was a part of the UGC program, it got considerably not cut, but frozen, and the interest in it was wavering. And then I saw Discovery Channel, and I was amazed with their focused objective. It's a private company for profit, but they would do nothing beyond what they then called documentaries. We used a different word in India, because documentary in India in those days meant that when it comes on, the cinema theater empties and everybody goes and buys popcorn or has a smoke. So not documentaries, but real world entertainment is the name we gave it. And they were focused only on that. No entertainment, no movies, nothing. So I was excited saying, here's a chance to prove that this thing works. So I took it as a challenge, and I can only say that at the end of 5 years, I was delighted that National Geographic came in as a competitor. That meant that we had created a genre where they saw a market for themselves too. And I was happy enough, and that was that.
So having created what would be the large experiment of direct to home, which sometimes some of us also refer as cable television, was that a satisfying experience for you, Dr. Kiran Karnik?
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I've done many things in my rather long career, which you can see from my gray hair. But this was yet, possibility, it's, nostalgia. But I think it's not just that. It was probably the most exciting phase of my career and the most exciting kind of work that I don't speak personally, that most of us involved with site have ever done. I talked to many colleagues at that time, and they're all retired now, and they yet say, yes, you're right. That was the time when we had the most excitement, the most fulfillment, the most satisfaction. And when you think back to all the things we did in our life, that's one thing that stands out like a lighthouse.
So in a way, it was the catalyst which made ISRO what it is today. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I would hope so. I would hope that the focus on application stays. When ISRO started, the concept was very clear. It stood on two legs. One was space science and exploration. And it started with that, in fact, cosmic ray research, sounding balloons, sounding rockets, going on to other rockets. And the second was applications. Technology was a means, never an end in itself. It was not that we're going to do the latest technology, or that we're going to do what X country did last year, or more importantly, and I love the Sarabhai quote on this, which I won't go through, that we want to be the first up there, the second person to do this. It was, what can we do which solves the problems of this country and maybe outside? And what can we do to advance knowledge, which is space science? So two very clear things. And everything else were enablers. And I would hope that that ethos continues and stays. No vanity projects, no show projects, no competition for its own sake, just competing to see what can you do for the people in this country.
What a pleasure speaking to you, Dr. Kiran Karnik, a pioneer on the site experiment, which gave the world large-scale direct-to-home, and today we live off literally direct-to-home or now we have smartphones, and we are getting probably satellite to phone direct connectivities very soon. It's not yet on in India, but smartphones have changed a lot. But yet, lots and lots and lots of homes are still connected with direct to home television. And here was one pioneer, Dr. Kiran Karnik, through his team, a very large team, which did way back in 1975, which was unheard of, to take television to rural India. What a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks a lot for
Thank you, Pallav.